Tantor Audio presents The Nuns of Sant'Ambrogio, The True Story of a Convent in Scandal, by Hubert Wolfe. Translated by Ruth Martin. Narrated by Paul Boehmer. Prologue. Save me. Shortly after 8 o'clock on Monday, July 25th, the Archbishop of Edessa, sent by the Lord, finally came to me. There was no time for waiting. This was the one and only time to get saved. To him I had to reveal everything, and had to implore him to help me escape the convent as swiftly as possible. It all went well. My prayers were fulfilled, and I was understood. These dramatic words were set down by Princess Katharina von Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen in a complaint she submitted to the Pope in summer 1859. They were written barely 5 weeks after her escape from the convent of Sant'Ambrogio in Rome, or rather after her cousin Archbishop Gustav Adolf zu Hohenlohe-Schillingsfürst managed to secure her release, and they describe the sensational conclusion to her adventure inside the walls of a Roman Catholic convent. It was an adventure for which she had narrowly avoided paying with her life. She had been humiliated, isolated from her fellow nuns, cut off from the outside world, and, since she was party to the convent secrets and therefore regarded as a danger, somebody had tried to silence her. They had even made several attempts to poison her. At 3:30 in the afternoon on July 26, 1859, after almost exactly 15 months, she finally left Sant'Ambrogio della Massima. Her life as Sister Luisa Maria of St. Joseph, a nun in the regulated Third Order of Holy St. Francis in Rome, had begun so promisingly, and now here she was, being saved in the nick of time, rescued from imminent danger of death. In her written complaint, the princess gave her failure as a nun and her thrilling escape from the convent a typically pious interpretation, casting it as salvation by Christ the Lord. This somehow made the experience bearable for her, but the final dramatic episode and the preceding months she had spent under the constant fear of death would come to define her whole life. After July 26th, 1859, nothing would ever be the same again. Her plight had been genuinely existential. Her life really was threatened in Sant'Ambrogio. Even years later, she was still traumatized by the attempts to poison her. This is all brought vividly to life in her Erlebnisse, Experiences, a book written by her close collaborator, Christian Gemeiner, in 1870, more than a decade after the terrible events in Rome. According to this autobiographical source, Katharina had managed to smuggle a letter out of the convent during the night of July 24, 1859. This was handed to Archbishop Hohenlohe in the Vatican. The princess waited in a state of great anxiety until she was called into the parlor at 7:30 in the morning. Fearful and almost breathless, the princess hurried downstairs to the archbishop, to whom she called out in great agitation, "Save me!" At first he did not understand her, and was almost afraid his cousin had run mad. But by and by she managed to convince him that she was mistress of her senses, and that her fear was not unfounded. Now he understood her pleas to leave the convent, and he promised to do everything in his power to arrange this as soon as possible, though the first appointment he was able to make was not until the following day. The words are Christian Gemeiner's recounting in the third person what the princess had told her in her own words. Katharina von Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen's account sounds like a story from the depths of the Middle Ages and confirms many of the common clichés and prejudices about life in Catholic convents and monasteries. But this story takes place in the modern world of the mid-19th century, and the setting isn't a secluded mountain convent at the world's edge, but the center of the capital city of Christianity, little more than half a mile from the Vatican, home to the representative of Jesus Christ on earth. What really happened in Sant'Ambrogio? Were these poisonings simply the fantasy of a highly strung aristocrat? Or were they genuine attempts on Caterina's life? She was a princess of the House of Hohenzollern, and a close relative of Wilhelm I, the man who would later become King of Prussia and the German Emperor. So how did Caterina come to take her vows in such a strict religious order in the first place? And why in Rome? Chapter 1. Such turpitudes. Caterina von Hohenzollern complains to the Inquisition. Rome as a heavenly Jerusalem. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Johann Joachim Winckelmann both longed for Italy, intoxicated by the idea of Rome, the stronghold of classical antiquity. But it wasn't this idea that drove Caterina there. Nor was she following in the footsteps of the great German royal houses, from the Carolingas to the Staufer Carolingians, who had come to the city on the Tiber to take the emperor's crown. Caterina's destination was an order of pious women, so her motivation for coming to the Pope's city must have been largely religious. But starting in the mid-18th century, Rome had undergone a dramatic decline as a religious center. Situated in the middle of Italy, the Papal States covered at least a quarter of the Apennine Peninsula, and as their secular prince, the Pope was increasingly drawn into political and military conflicts to protect his rule. This left him less and less able to take care of his duties as spiritual head of the Catholic Church. Toward the end of the century, religious respect for papal authority sank to an all-time low. In 1773, the European powers even managed to force Clement XIV to dissolve the Jesuit order, his most important political supporters within the Church. Napoleon Bonaparte annexed the Pope's lands and forced Pius VII into French exile. Following the Pope's return, the 1815 Congress of Vienna restored the Papal States as an independent entity. But although Cardinal Secretary of State Ercole Consalvi promised the Congress that in return reforms would be implemented in the areas of governance, legislation, education, and the economy, these never materialized. The Papal States remained the most backward political entity in the whole of Europe. However, following the Wars of Liberation, the Restoration had become a dominant movement in Europe, and the Pope was able to regain the people's respect for him as a moral and religious authority. He had suddenly become the only monarch in Europe to have defied the beast Napoleon, earning a spell in exile for his convictions. All the other rulers had made deals with the French emperor. To the Romantic mind, papal authority was a guarantee of eternal values, in particular of the divine right of kings. It was a protective force against the chaos and uncertainty of the French Revolution, with its liberal understanding of constitutional law and human rights. Leo XII was particularly adept at utilizing this desire for security. The Eternal City would once again become the most sacred place on earth. German Catholics were increasingly turning toward Rome in the wake of secularization and the destruction of the old imperial church with its prince-bishoprics. Most had become the subjects of Protestant princes and were seeking salvation through a closer connection with the Pope. After the July Revolution of 1830, there was a phase of growing ultramontanism within the Catholic Church. Catholics were starting to look ultramontes, beyond the mountains, to Rome. Roman piety, Roman liturgy, and Roman theology were increasingly regarded as the only true realizations of Catholicism, legitimated by the Pope in his role as Vicarius Christi. With this movement in full swing, the Catholic press began to style Rome as the Bride of Christ, the Holy City, a heavenly Jerusalem on earth. This religious elevation of the papacy didn't stem from the popes and the Roman Curia itself. it was brought to the Pope from outside. The pontiff became the surface onto which people could project their need for religious security in an age of upheaval, doubt, and revolution. During this period, people began to rediscover the idea of making a pilgrimage to Rome. Having a personal encounter with the Pope, praying over the graves of the apostles Peter and Paul, and the religious self-assurance this brought with it, became markers of a genuine Catholic faith. The members of the Roman Curia utilized this new orientation toward Rome in very different ways. The College of Cardinals split into zelanti and politicanti. The first groups, the zealots, wanted to use the new enthusiasm for Rome to suppress any kind of reform in the Church and the Papal States, increasingly absolutizing the Pope as the infallible sacred monarch. The other members, the pragmatists, were rather more skeptical, seeing that this represented a threat to their program of reconciliation between the Church and the world. There were mighty clashes between hawks and doves, particularly when it came to electing a new pope. Hardliners and moderates scored alternate victories in the conclaves. Katharina von Hohenzollern and her mother also headed for Rome as part of a procession of pilgrims largely drawn from the higher echelons of society. They entered Rome for the first time in 1834, during the pontificate of Gregory XVI, who was a Zealand. The Pope and his circle harbored a general mistrust of the modern world, with all its progressive political ideas, scientific discoveries, and economic developments. During his reign he built the Holy City into a kind of spiritual fortress against the diabolical powers of liberalism, since the repercussions of the French July Revolution hadn't spared the theocratic Papal States. Gregory XVI was deeply traumatized by the Revolution and, consequently, persecuted all innovators within the Catholic Church. For this Pope, anything that looked remotely like freedom, reform, or modern education had a whiff of brimstone about it. He believed the Catholic Church should be concentrated on Rome and furnished as a house full of glory. The Church would stand up to modernity and would eventually emerge victorious against it, through the triumph of the Holy See, as the title of a book written by the Pope would have it. Following on from this Restoration pontiff, Giovanni Maria Mattei Ferretti was elected Pope on June 16, 1846. He was a moderate politicant, and consequently took the name of his predecessor's predecessor, becoming Pius IX. The new Pope, a man of great personal charm, began his pontificate by pushing through a series of reforms. He decreed an amnesty for political prisoners, set up a civilian government, and promised his subjects a constitution that would give them a say in the political life of the Papal States. This liberal stance met with broad approval from the Roman population, but sparks from the 1848 March Revolution in the German states landed in the Pope's city. People became radicalized, and Pius IX was ultimately forced to flee to Gaeta, in the Kingdom of Naples. It was only after French troops had put down the uprising that the Pope was able to return to the Vatican in 1850. The trauma of the 1848 revolution shaped his pontificate from then on. All reforms were rescinded. Policy in the Papal States and the Church's magisterium became distinctly reactionary. Like his predecessor, Gregory XVI, the Pope felt persecuted and threatened from all sides. He developed an almost apocalyptic fear of the Papal States' occupation by Italian nationalist troops. Only foreign troops could secure Pius IX's temporal power in the Papal States against the Risorgimento, the national unification movement that saw Rome as the natural capital of a new Italian nation-state. This siege mentality extended to the religious sphere. At the start of Pius IX's pontificate, he had listened to liberal cardinals and prelates, as well as hardliners and intransigents. but now the balance shifted toward the latter. In the first half of the 19th century, Rome had been a city of religious pluralism. The various factions and theological movements that existed in Germany and France, for example, were reflected in the offices and congregations of the Roman Curia. Some members of the Curia sought reconciliation between church and world, modern philosophy and Catholic faith. Others were romantics and new scholastics, who saw the only conceivable basis for Catholicism in the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. The Jesuit order and the Collegio Romano, whose faculty it dominated, increasingly became a stronghold for hyper-orthodoxy and Rome's new scholastics, while the Benedictine Abbey of St. Paul outside the walls prescribed a more open, pluralistic model of piety and theology, incorporating newer philosophical approaches. From 1848, the Pope increasingly came down on the side of the conservatives, ordering the Inquisition and the Congregation of the Index to pursue any divergent theological opinions. Numerous modern theologians found themselves on the index of forbidden books. During the time of Pius IX, the index went from being a means of controlling the book market to a means of disciplining independent thinkers within the Church. Different theological and political orientations within the Church corresponded to quite different religious practices and mentalities. The reactionary, romantic faction sought to restore Baroque Catholicism's exalted forms of devotion. They rediscovered mysticism, which had been discredited during the Enlightenment, and looked for miracles at every turn. The liberal elements of the Curia preferred a more sober piety, a faith that could endure the demands of the modern age of reason. Here, too, Pius IX's preferences were very clear. The Pope firmly believed that heavenly powers could intervene in the here and now. As a child, he had fallen into a raging river, and he attributed his rescue directly to a helping hand from the Mother of God. This was the environment that Katharina von Hohenzollern entered when she finally decided to move to Rome in 1857. At this point, the city of Rome was small and manageable. When Gregorovius, the city's chronicler, arrived at the Tiber for the first time in 1852, he noted in his diary, "Rome is so entirely silent that one can live in heavenly tranquility and think and work." Gregorovius's impression is unsurprising, given that the city had just 180,000 inhabitants. Of these, around 7,500 were priests and nuns. There was no compulsory education, though the elementary schools ensured that roughly a third of the population could read and write. Of the 5.5 square miles of the city that lay within its 14 miles of ancient walls, a good third was built up. The remaining land was given over to farming. The Forum Romanum was used to pasture cattle. There were 14,700 buildings, housing 39,000 families, who belonged to 54 different parishes. Gas lamps weren't installed on the streets until 1854, and there was no railway. The 19th century's industrialization and subsequent economic boom had touched neither the Eternal City nor the 16,000 square miles and 3.2 million inhabitants of the Papal States. The disparity in income was immense. A high prelate in the Curia earned just under 2,000 scudi per year, while a middle-class family of 6 needed around 650 scudi, and a farming family of the same size survived on 250 scudi. An agricultural laborer earned 72 scudi a year, and a shepherd boy received 32 scudi. A Road to Damascus Experience and its Consequences. Katharina's first encounter with Rome in the year 1834 represented a crucial turning point in her life. She had been born in Stuttgart on January 19, 1817, to Prince Karl Albrecht III zu Hohenlohe-Waldenburg-Schillingfürst and his second wife, Leopoldine zu Fürstenberg. Her parents had her baptized into the Catholic faith. They separated a few years after her birth, her father withdrawing to live on his Hohenlohe estates, and the princess spent most of her childhood in Donaueschingen with her mother and her Fürstenberg relatives. Her strictly orthodox biographers speak with deep regret about a very liberal upbringing in Baden, lamenting that she had no real religious guidance throughout her childhood and youth. When the 17-year-old Caterina traveled to Rome with her mother in 1834, she had a road to Damascus experience. In the Pope's city, Caterina embraced the Catholic faith in its strictest form, and the liberal young girl became a pious Catholic noblewoman. The transformation was due in no small part to Karl August, Count von Reisach. Reisach, born on July 6, 1800, was a member of the Swabian-Franconian nobility, like Katharina von Hohenlohe-Waldenburg-Schillingfürst. He had had a difficult start in life. His father, who was constantly on the brink of financial catastrophe, had been accused of misappropriation of funds and had relieved himself of his responsibilities by committing suicide in 1820. This must have been a formative experience in the life of the young count. Reisach studied law, but his hopes of a professorship in Landshut were dashed, and his marriage plans also came to nothing. Reisach, searching for orientation and a foothold in the world, then fell under the influence of two men. The first was Clemens Maria Hofbauer, a Redemptorist Catholic priest who had converted from Protestantism. The second was Adam Müller, a professor of constitutional law in Göttingen, who advocated a romantic, corporative model of society, with the Pope at its head. Reisach decided to head for Rome to take refuge from the uncertainties of his life. He wanted to become a priest, and went to study theology in the only place where, in his view, he would receive orthodox tuition. In October 1824 he became the first German to enter the Collegio Romano since German secularization. The college had recently been reopened by Leo XII, and later became the Pontifical Gregorian University. Reisach moved into the Collegium Germanicum, the Roman seminary for German candidates for the priesthood. Under the influence of the Jesuits, Reisach developed into a zealot. Ordained in 1828, he was also awarded a doctorate in theology and became rector of the Propaganda Fide College, part of the Congregation of the Propagation of the Faith. He formed a particularly close and faithful relationship with its prefect, Cardinal Mauro Capellari. The two men were united by a strictly restorative orientation and a rejection of all reforms, which Reisach viewed as a tightly woven conspiracy of liberal theologians and philosophers with the aim of abolishing the Catholic Church. After Capellari took the papal throne as Gregory XVI, Reisach became his closest ally in the struggle against church reformers, particularly those in the southwest of Germany, Caterina's home. Caterina must have been fascinated by this young priest. Reisach immediately became her father-confessor and spiritual guide, thereby gaining a decisive influence over her future. The princess not only promised to open her soul to him in the sacrament of confession, but from thenceforth to turn to him for advice and guidance in all things. An intense correspondence developed between confessor and penitent. In her youthful exuberance, Caterina was eager to follow Reisach into the battle for the Church, and expressed her desire to enter a Dominican convent in Rome. But Reisach seems to have opposed this idea. He probably saw it as the whim of a 17-year-old rather than a mature religious decision. She should do her duty as a wife and mother first, as befitted her status as a young noblewoman. And Caterina von Hohenlohe duly put on a wedding dress instead of a nun's habit. Her niece, Marie von Thurn und Taxis Hohenlohe, later wrote that Caterina had fallen passionately in love with a Count Ingelheim, whom my grandparents would not countenance as a husband. The young man, who was otherwise very agreeable, was thought to be a consumptive, but Aunt Caterina got her way and married him in spite of all resistance. The wedding took place in 1838. Count Erfen von Ingelheim really did die young in 1845, and the marriage remained childless. 3 years later, Caterina entered the state of holy matrimony once more, though this time it seems to have been a marriage of convenience. In 1848, she married Prince Karl von Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen, who was 34 years her senior. His first marriage had been to Antoinette Murat, a niece of Napoleon Bonaparte's brother-in-law. Prince Karl brought several stepchildren to the marriage, almost all of them older than his second wife. But this marriage didn't last long, either. The prince contracted typhus on a journey through northern Italy and died in Bologna on March 11, 1853. After only 5 years of marriage, Caterina, who was now 36, had been widowed for a second time. From her husband's family she received an estate in Bistritz, Bohemia, as her dower residence, and a pension of 12,000 Rhenish guilders, which later rose to 15,000. There was also a lump sum payment of 100,000 guilders. She used this to set up a fund from which she intended to finance the founding of a convent later in life. But first, she fulfilled her heart's desire, the ambition she had first expressed in Rome in 1834. Caterina became a nun. On December 18, 1853, she entered the community of the Dames du Sacre-Cœur in Kinsheim, Alsace. In many ways, the Nuns of the Sacred Heart were like the English ladies. Their congregation was also dedicated to the education of girls, inspired by a Jesuit concept of pedagogy, and people thought of them as a kind of female equivalent of the Jesuits. On March 11th of the following year, Caterina was clothed as a novice. However, it soon became clear that the princess was neither physically nor mentally equal to the strains of serving in the school. She felt overtaxed and, with her dream of cloistered life shattered, she reacted by falling ill. Medical treatments and rest cures brought her no relief. Was this reaction a typical pattern of behavior for the princess when faced with failure? Might this not suggest she could have made up a story about poisoning a few years later in a Roman convent? This would mean she wouldn't have to confess that, once again, she had failed as a nun and become seriously ill. In any case, her spiritual guide, Reisach, consulted with her doctors and suggested that she withdraw immediately from the convent in Alsace. In the 19th century, during Germany's convent spring, many women joined religious orders and congregations in order to become teachers or nurses, jobs from which they would otherwise have been barred. But this clearly wasn't the right path for Caterina. Reisach, who had become Bishop of Eichstätt in 1836 and Archbishop of Munich and Freising in 1846, thought her not inclined to or trained for the educational profession. In his view, this teaching order was simply unsuitable for a sickly widow, doubly bowed by her life's tribulations. The sources don't clarify exactly what the princess's health problems were. In his 1912 biography of Caterina, Karl Theodor Zingeler speaks of a dropsy, an abnormal collection of fluid in the body from which the corpulent princess suffered all her life. Following Reisach's advice, Caterina left the Sacred Heart Convent in November 1855 and spent the winter in Kupferzell and Baden-Baden. She then returned to Bistritz, her widow's seat. In summer, her disease led her to seek out the convent of Lichtental, near Baden-Baden. Her health stabilized somewhat over the following year, and she recalled Reisach's words to her, written from Rome following her departure from Kinsheim. Pius IX had made him a cardinal of the Roman Curia on December 17, 1855. In a few years, come to Rome, when your health has improved. In summer 1857, the princess moved to the Eternal City. She took up residence in the Palazzo
Sample complete. Ready to continue?